Someone who helped separate you and your soulmate finally broke their silence. The family wasn't prepared for the truth. My beloved child. Someone who helped separate you and your soulmate has finally broken their silence, and what they admitted has shaken the very people who once believed they knew the whole story. For a long time, your soulmate's family thought the distance between you happened naturally. They believed feelings changed, circumstances became complicated, and the two of you simply reached a point where staying apart seemed easier. But one person in that family knew differently. They had been carrying a secret about a private conversation that happened shortly before everything between you and your soulmate began falling apart. And now, after months of avoiding questions, that person finally said something no one expected. They never wanted to leave. The room went silent. Because if your soulmate never truly wanted the separation, then someone had influenced what happened. But who, and why? At first, the person tried to soften the confession. They claimed they were only trying to protect your soulmate from getting hurt. But then another family member asked one simple question: protect them from what? That was when their explanation started unraveling. They admitted that certain things about you had been exaggerated. Small doubts were turned into warnings. Ordinary misunderstandings were presented as evidence that the relationship could never work. And whenever your soulmate tried to defend you, they were told they were being emotional and refusing to see reality. Imagine hearing that after believing all this time that your soulmate simply stopped choosing you. Don't skip, because the most disturbing detail wasn't that someone interfered. It was that your soulmate had apparently asked one final question before walking away. A question this person deliberately refused to answer. That question was about something you supposedly said. Your soulmate had been told that you were already preparing to move forward without them, and that waiting for you would only lead to humiliation. But they didn't immediately believe it. They asked, did those words actually come from them? The person standing before the family now lowered their eyes, because everyone suddenly understood why that question mattered. They had never heard those words directly from you. There was no message. No recording. No undeniable proof. Only someone else's version of what you supposedly felt. Your soulmate had made an emotional decision based on information they trusted, and the person who supplied that information had known there was more to the story. But just when the family thought they understood the betrayal, the confession became even more serious. Because this person revealed they hadn't acted alone. And when they finally said who had encouraged them to keep you apart, one member of the family immediately stood up. The chair scraped sharply against the floor as that family member stood, and suddenly the confession felt far more dangerous than anyone had expected. Their face changed the moment the second person was mentioned, not because the name was unfamiliar, but because they knew exactly what that person had done. For months, this individual had presented themselves as the calm voice in the middle, comforting your soulmate while quietly encouraging the family to accept the separation. They repeatedly said you and your soulmate were better apart. But now the truth was becoming clear: they had helped create the very pain they later pretended to soothe. Your soulmate had trusted their advice because it came from someone close, someone who seemed to have nothing to gain. So why were they so determined to keep you away? That question hung in the room until the person confessing finally whispered, because they were afraid of what would happen if those two spoke directly. That single sentence changed everything. Someone immediately asked what a direct conversation between you and your soulmate could possibly expose. The person hesitated, then admitted there had been several moments when your soulmate wanted to contact you and clear everything up. Once, they even had their phone in their hand, ready to send a message. But each time, someone stepped in with another warning. They were told you had already made your decision. They were told reaching out would make them look desperate. Worst of all, they were convinced that you had specifically asked to be left alone. But that claim had never been verified. Your soulmate wasn't rejecting you, they were respecting a boundary they believed you had created. And while the family absorbed that revelation, another detail surfaced. One night, your soulmate had written something meant for you. Something they almost sent. Something that could have changed the entire direction of your relationship. Nobody in the room knew about that message except the two people who had helped keep you apart. The confession continued slowly, almost painfully. Your soulmate had written that they didn't understand what had happened between you, but they still cared deeply and wanted one honest conversation before letting everything disappear. They wanted the truth from you, not rumors, assumptions, or family opinions. Yet that message never reached you. Why? Someone demanded. For several seconds, there was no answer. Then came the admission that stunned the family again: your soulmate had been persuaded to delete it before sending it. Stay till the end, because the reason they were pressured to erase that message had nothing to do with protecting them from heartbreak. The person confessing finally revealed that someone inside the family had been hiding a personal motive all along, and your soulmate had recently begun to suspect exactly who it was. Your soulmate's suspicion began with one tiny contradiction that nobody else had noticed. The family member who had supposedly been protecting them kept changing the story about you. First, they claimed you wanted distance. Later, they said you had completely moved on. Then, during an argument, they accidentally mentioned something about your feelings that they could not possibly have known without speaking to someone else. Your soulmate caught it immediately. Who told you that? They asked. There was no convincing answer. From that moment, everything they had been told began looking different. The warnings. The pressure. The deleted message. Even those painful weeks when your soulmate stayed silent because they believed contacting you would disrespect your wishes. And now, listening to this confession, the family realized your soulmate had started questioning the separation long before anyone knew. But the personal motive was still being avoided. One relative finally demanded the truth. What did keeping them apart accomplish for you? The person confessing looked toward the floor and admitted that certain members of the family had already imagined a completely different future for your soulmate. They wanted someone they considered easier to accept, easier to understand, and most importantly, easier for the family to influence. You represented something they couldn't control. Around you, your soulmate had started making decisions independently. They questioned expectations they had followed for years. They spoke about choosing their own happiness instead of living according to everyone else's approval. That frightened someone close to them. So the interference wasn't really about anything terrible you had done. It was about what your connection encouraged your soulmate to become. But then came another question nobody was prepared for. If that was the motive, how far had the interference actually gone? The answer arrived when the person admitted there had been one final conversation after your soulmate deleted that message to you. Your soulmate had looked directly at the family member involved and said, "If I find out you lied to me about them, I will never see this family the same way again." Those words had been kept secret until now. Something huge is waiting for you, because your soulmate hadn't simply forgotten that warning afterward. Quietly, they began checking details. They remembered dates. They compared conversations. They asked careful questions without revealing what they suspected. And eventually, one particular claim about you collapsed completely. The person confessing knew exactly which claim it was, but before they could explain, the family member who had stood up suddenly interrupted, "Don't tell them about that night." Everyone turned toward them. Because until those 5 words were spoken, nobody else in the room even knew there had been a night worth hiding. That warning exposed more than silence ever could, because the moment they said, "Don't tell them about that night," everyone understood there was another layer to the separation. Your soulmate had apparently tried to reach you one last time after becoming suspicious of the stories they had been told. They didn't announce it to the family. They simply left the house with one intention, to finally hear the truth from you directly. But before they could follow through, someone found out. A phone call came. Then another. Your soulmate was told that contacting you would reopen everything and create consequences they couldn't undo. Yet this time, they pushed back. They asked why everyone seemed terrified of one honest conversation between the two of you. And the answer they received that night was so strangely specific that your soulmate remembered every word. They were told you had personally confirmed that you wanted nothing more to do with them. Not, maybe. Not, it seems that way. They were told it as an absolute fact. Your soulmate stopped and asked the obvious question, "When did you speak to them?" That was where the story should have fallen apart, but another person stepped in and backed it up. 2 trusted voices repeated the same claim, making it sound impossible to doubt. So your soulmate went home believing the door had finally closed. But now, in front of the family, the person who had broken their silence admitted something devastating: no such conversation with you had ever happened. They had repeated a story they knew was unverified because they were afraid of challenging the person who started it. The family stared at them in disbelief. One lie had been supported by another, and your soulmate had paid the emotional price. Then someone asked the question that changed the atmosphere completely: "Does your soulmate know this now?" The answer was not what anyone expected. They didn't know everything, but they had discovered enough. Recently, your soulmate had confronted the person who originally claimed you wanted them gone and asked for one simple piece of proof. A message. A date. Anything showing that those words had actually come from you. Nothing could be produced. That silence gave your soulmate the answer they had feared for months. But instead of confronting the entire family immediately, they made an unexpected decision. They began searching for the one person who could settle every question without another relative speaking for them, you. And just before this confession happened, your soulmate had apparently said something quietly that nobody was supposed to repeat: "This time, if I speak to them, nobody is standing between us." What the family still didn't know was that your soulmate had already taken the first step. The first step your soulmate took was so quiet that the family completely missed it. Instead of announcing that they planned to contact you, they began removing the voices that had controlled the story for so long. They stopped asking relatives what you supposedly felt. They stopped accepting second-hand explanations. Then they went back through old conversations, comparing what they personally remembered with what others had later convinced them to believe. One detail kept bothering them. There had been a moment shortly before the separation when you showed no sign of wanting them gone. In fact, your words suggested the opposite. So how could your feelings have supposedly changed overnight? Your soulmate finally realized there was a missing piece between the last honest moment you shared and the first warning they received about you. And someone in that room knew exactly what it was. The person who had broken their silence finally admitted what happened during that missing window. A private conversation about you had taken place without your soulmate present. Someone close to the family had argued that if your relationship continued, your soulmate would eventually choose you over the expectations placed on them. That possibility frightened certain people more than they were willing to admit. So instead of allowing your soulmate to make that choice freely, they began feeding both sides uncertainty. Your soulmate was made to believe you were pulling away, while opportunities for direct communication were quietly discouraged. But here was the detail that left the family speechless. The person confessing admitted they had eventually regretted participating. They had watched your soulmate become quieter after losing you, and that pain looked nothing like the better future everyone had promised. That was when guilt began turning into something they could no longer hide. Then came the revelation nobody expected. Weeks earlier, the guilty person had secretly saved something connected to the original interference, a message they had been told to erase. It wasn't a message from you, and it wasn't from your soulmate. It came from the person who had been pushing hardest for the separation, and its wording showed that keeping you apart had been discussed deliberately rather than happening naturally. Don't skip, because the family immediately demanded to see it. Hands trembling, the person reached for their phone and opened an old screenshot they had kept all this time. The first lines were enough to drain the color from one relative's face. But there was one sentence near the bottom that mattered more than everything else, because it revealed that the plan had never been simply to create temporary distance between you and your soulmate. They had been waiting for something specific to happen after the separation, and according to the timestamp, that next move began only 3 days after your soulmate walked away. 3 days after your soulmate walked away, the family member behind the interference began pushing the future they had wanted all along. The screenshot showed a message that read like instructions: keep your soulmate from contacting you, give them time to believe the separation was final, and then introduce them to someone the family already approved of. Suddenly, the motive became painfully clear. This had never been about giving your soulmate space to heal. Someone had wanted to replace you before your soulmate had the chance to question what really happened. But there was a problem they hadn't expected. Your soulmate showed no interest in meeting anyone new. Every suggestion was rejected. Every attempt to convince them that they should move forward only made them more distant. And one night, when someone mentioned that approved person again, your soulmate finally said, "Why is everyone so desperate for me to forget someone I never stopped caring about?" That sentence had frightened the people involved, because it proved the separation had not erased your soulmate's feelings. The person confessing now revealed that the family had tried one more tactic. They repeatedly reminded your soulmate of the things you supposedly said, hoping those false memories would become stronger than what your soulmate actually remembered about you. But instead, your soulmate began noticing contradictions. Why could nobody show them the original messages? Why did every important claim about you come through someone else? And why did the story change whenever they asked for details? The screenshot in the room answered part of that mystery. Yet another family member noticed something everyone else had missed. The message contained a reply underneath it. A reply written by the person who was now confessing. Someone asked them to scroll down. Their hands froze, because what they had written back revealed they had known from the beginning that the plan could destroy something real. The reply was short: "What if they find out we never gave them the truth?" Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the family member accused of starting everything demanded the phone, but this time nobody handed it over. The confession had moved beyond suspicion. There was finally something tangible showing that the separation had been manipulated. Stay till the end, because the next revelation changed where the family's anger was directed. The person who saved the screenshot admitted that your soulmate had already seen part of it. Not the entire exchange. Only enough to realize that people they trusted had discussed keeping you away. And your soulmate's reaction wasn't screaming or revenge. They became completely calm. Then they asked for the date of the original conversation and compared it with something saved on their own phone. When the dates matched, your soulmate apparently whispered, "Then they never abandoned me." But what they opened next was something even the person confessing had never seen. An old message from you that your soulmate had kept hidden through the entire separation. That old message had survived every attempt to convince your soulmate that you no longer cared. They had never deleted it, even during the days when believing it hurt the most. Your words were simple, but the timing changed everything. The message had been sent shortly before the family began insisting that you wanted distance, and nothing in it sounded like someone preparing to disappear. You had left the door open for honesty. You had shown concern. Most importantly, there was one sentence your soulmate kept returning to because it directly contradicted what they were later told about you. Suddenly, they understood why certain people had always discouraged them from looking backward. The truth had been sitting inside their own phone the entire time. And once your soulmate placed that message beside the screenshot exposing the family's private plan, the timeline became impossible to ignore. The person confessing then revealed something even more painful. Your soulmate had apparently asked them one private question after seeing the evidence: "Did they ever actually stop wanting me, or did all of you just make me believe they did?" There was no safe answer anymore. For the first time, the person admitted they had never possessed proof that you rejected your soulmate. They had followed someone else's story, helped reinforce it, and stayed silent because admitting the truth would expose their own involvement. Your soulmate listened without interrupting. Then they asked who else knew. That was the question that frightened everyone, because the answer showed the silence had spread further through the family than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Some had actively interfered. Others had suspected something was wrong but chose not to challenge it. And one person, someone your soulmate trusted deeply, had known almost everything. When that name was finally spoken aloud, the room changed. Nobody expected this person to be connected because they had always appeared sympathetic to your soulmate's heartbreak. They had watched your soulmate struggle, listened when they spoke about missing you, and still never revealed what they knew. But there was one reason for their silence that hadn't yet been explained. Your soulmate had already confronted them privately, asking why they allowed a false story to continue when one honest conversation could have changed everything. Their response wasn't an excuse. It was a confession of another secret. They had believed keeping you apart would protect something the family had been hiding long before you entered the picture. And then they told your soulmate, if you go back to them, you're going to discover what we never wanted you to know. Your soulmate didn't walk away after hearing that. They asked one chillingly simple question: what does any of this have to do with them? The answer finally connected you to the family's deepest fear. The family's deepest fear was never that you would hurt your soulmate, it was that your soulmate would begin seeing the family differently because of you. Before the separation, you had unknowingly asked questions about certain decisions your soulmate had always accepted without challenge. Why were they constantly expected to sacrifice their own plans? Why did one relative seem to have so much influence over their personal choices? Why did your soulmate feel guilty whenever they chose something simply because it made them happy? You weren't investigating anyone. You were noticing patterns because you cared. But those questions stayed with your soulmate, and slowly, they began asking them too. That was what frightened the family member who had controlled so much for so long. If your soulmate learned to trust their own judgment, the influence over them would disappear. Separating you became the easiest way to stop that change. When this was finally admitted aloud, your soulmate's silence suddenly made sense to everyone in the room. They hadn't only lost a relationship, they had been manipulated into doubting the one person who had encouraged them to think for themselves. The person who broke their silence admitted that they noticed the change almost immediately after you were gone. Your soulmate stopped arguing, but they also stopped sharing. They became polite, distant, careful. The family initially mistook that quietness for acceptance. It wasn't. Your soulmate had started watching everyone differently. Every contradiction became another clue. Every unexplained warning about you became another reason to question the story. Then your soulmate discovered something especially revealing. The relative who claimed you were bad for them had privately admitted, before the separation, that your influence was making your soulmate too independent. Those two words exposed the motive more clearly than any excuse ever could. But the confession still wasn't finished. The person speaking revealed that guilt had finally become unbearable because your soulmate had recently made a decision nobody in the family knew about. They weren't waiting for another explanation. They weren't asking permission. And they certainly weren't allowing anyone else to speak on your behalf again. Your soulmate had decided that the only way to know what you truly felt was to hear it directly from you. Something huge is waiting for you, because they had already prepared what they wanted to say if that conversation happened. It wasn't an accusation, and it wasn't a desperate plea to return to the past. They wanted to begin with one question: were you ever told that I chose to leave you? The person confessing knew why that question mattered. If your answer was what your soulmate suspected, then nearly every decision made after the separation would have been built on the same lie. But before anyone could react, another family member quietly admitted, there's something else they need to know before those two speak. The new admission came from the last person anyone expected to speak. They had stayed quiet through every accusation, every screenshot, every uncomfortable question, but now they revealed that after the separation, your soulmate had tried to reach you more than once. The family knew about only one attempt. There had actually been 3. The first was the deleted message. The second was a late-night call your soulmate ended before it connected because someone convinced them you would reject them. But the third attempt was different. Your soulmate had written a longer message explaining that they never wanted things to end through silence and misunderstanding. They were ready to admit they still cared. This time, they believed the message had been sent. Yet you never responded, and for months, your soulmate interpreted that silence as your final answer. There was only one problem. According to the person speaking now, that message may never have reached you at all. Everyone immediately demanded an explanation. The family member admitted that your soulmate had shown the message to someone before sending it, asking whether it sounded sincere. That person persuaded them to wait until morning. By morning, your soulmate was told the message had already been sent during the confusion of the previous night and that your lack of response meant you wanted no contact. Your soulmate never checked carefully because they were emotionally exhausted and trusted the person standing beside them. But weeks later, while searching through their phone, they noticed something strange. There was no clear record of that message in the conversation with you. At first, they assumed they had deleted it themselves. Now, after everything else had surfaced, that missing message looked completely different. Don't skip, because the person confessing suddenly remembered seeing something that morning, your soulmate's phone in someone else's hands. The room erupted with questions, but your soulmate's family was beginning to understand the scale of what had happened. This wasn't one misunderstanding anymore. It was a chain of interference that repeatedly prevented 2 people from hearing each other directly. And the person who had handled the phone was the same relative whose private message had discussed keeping you apart. When confronted, they insisted they had only been trying to prevent another emotional mistake. But then someone asked the question they could no longer avoid: did you delete that message? Their face gave away more than their words. They hesitated, looked toward the person who had first broken their silence, and finally admitted they had opened the phone that morning. They claimed they couldn't remember exactly what they changed. Nobody believed them. Then the original confessor interrupted with a detail that made your soulmate's entire family go quiet again. They had seen the message before it disappeared, and they could still remember the final sentence your soulmate had written specifically for you. The final sentence your soulmate had written was the one thing nobody could explain away: if there is still something between us, please let me hear it from you, not from anyone else. Those words hit the room differently because they proved your soulmate had already understood the real danger. Even then, before the screenshots and confessions, they sensed that other voices had taken control of something that should have belonged only to the 2 of you. The person who remembered the message admitted your soulmate had rewritten that final line several times because they didn't want to pressure you. They simply wanted clarity. Yet instead of receiving your answer, they were led to believe their message had reached you and your silence was the answer. For months, that belief shaped everything. But now your soulmate knew the silence between you might never have been chosen by either of you. That realization changed the family conversation completely. The questions were no longer about whether someone interfered. The evidence had answered that. Now everyone wanted to know why the truth had been hidden for so long. The person who first broke their silence finally admitted they had almost confessed months earlier after seeing how deeply the separation affected your soulmate. They even approached the relative responsible and said, "We need to tell them what really happened." But they were warned that revealing everything would destroy the family's trust and possibly bring you back into your soulmate's life. That warning kept them quiet, until your soulmate started uncovering the truth alone. Once they realized the lies were collapsing anyway, guilt became heavier than fear. And there was another reason they chose this moment to confess. Your soulmate had recently asked them directly whether you had ever been given a fair chance to speak. The answer had been no. Your soulmate didn't argue when they heard it. They simply stood there for a long moment, absorbing what that meant. Then they said something that terrified the people who had controlled the story. "Then I'm going to give them that chance now. Stay till the end, because this wasn't an emotional threat spoken in anger." Your soulmate had already decided how they wanted to approach you. No family messenger. No carefully edited version of events. No assumptions about what you might feel today. They wanted one private, honest conversation where both of you could finally compare what you were told with what actually happened. But just as the family realized they could no longer prevent it, the person who had started the interference made one last admission. They looked directly at your soulmate and said, "Before you contact them, there is one thing I lied about that nobody here knows." And this time, even the person who had broken their silence looked shocked. The person who had started the interference could barely meet your soulmate's eyes when they finally explained the last lie. It concerned the moment your soulmate had supposedly been told that you were happier without them. For months, they had carried those words like a final verdict, believing someone had personally heard you say that the separation brought you relief. But now came the admission, you had never said anything like that. The statement had been invented after your soulmate began questioning whether leaving you had been a mistake. It was designed to stop them from turning back. Your soulmate stared at the person in disbelief and asked, "So every time I wanted to reach out, you gave me another reason not to?" Nobody interrupted. Because everyone in that room finally understood that your soulmate hadn't been allowed to make one clean decision based on the truth. Then your soulmate asked something even harder, "Was there ever anything they actually said that proved they wanted me gone?" The answer was silence. Not one person could produce a message, a conversation, or a direct statement from you. Everything had traveled through somebody else. That realization seemed to break something open inside your soulmate, not into anger, but clarity. They remembered all the nights they had blamed themselves for missing you. They remembered wondering why letting go felt impossible when they had been told you already had. Now they understood why. Their heart had been responding to what they genuinely experienced with you, while their mind had been forced to trust a story created afterward. And suddenly the question was no longer whether the past had been manipulated. It was whether there was still enough truth left between you to begin one honest conversation. But before your soulmate could leave, the original confessor asked them to wait. There was one final piece of information they had deliberately saved for this moment because they knew it would change what happened next. After the separation, someone had unexpectedly asked about you, not to criticize you, but because they had started doubting the family's version of events. That person had quietly checked one of the claims used to keep your soulmate away and discovered it was false. They had confronted the relative responsible, but instead of exposing them immediately, they kept what they learned private. Why? Because they wanted your soulmate to discover the truth without another person controlling the conclusion. Now they were finally willing to speak directly. Something huge is waiting for you, because when the confessor revealed who this person was, your soulmate froze. It was someone whose word the entire family trusted. And they had been carrying evidence that could prove exactly when the story about you was first fabricated. The person holding that evidence had been present near the beginning, before the story about you grew into something everyone treated as fact. They remembered the exact evening because your soulmate had come home speaking warmly about you, not like someone whose relationship was collapsing. Hours later, the first warning appeared. You were supposedly pulling away and preparing to leave. That sudden change had always bothered them. So they quietly kept a copy of an early family exchange where the person behind the interference wrote something revealing. They needed to make your soulmate understand that continuing with you would only create problems. The wording mattered. It wasn't describing something you had done. It was describing a conclusion they wanted your soulmate to reach. And for the first time, the family could see the manipulation beginning before the supposed evidence against you even existed. Your soulmate read the exchange twice, then asked for the date. When they saw it, another memory returned. That was the same day you and your soulmate had spoken normally. There had been no dramatic goodbye. No rejection. No indication that you wanted everything to end. Yet only hours afterward, someone had already begun building a story that the relationship was doomed. Your soulmate's expression changed. So this started before I ever said I wanted distance, they whispered. The person with the evidence nodded. That meant even your soulmate's eventual decision to step away had come after pressure had already begun. But one question remained: why had this witness waited so long to reveal what they knew? Their answer surprised everyone. They had confronted the person responsible privately and been promised the interference would stop. Instead, it became more careful, more indirect, and much harder to prove. Then the witness revealed why they were speaking now. A few days earlier, your soulmate had unknowingly asked them a question that made silence impossible. If you knew I was making a life-changing decision based on a lie, would you tell me? The witness couldn't answer then. Now they could. They apologized for waiting and handed your soulmate the complete exchange, including one section nobody else had seen. Near the end was a response from another relative, someone who had publicly claimed they knew nothing about the plan. Their message was only a few words, but it showed they had understood exactly what was happening from the beginning. Your soulmate looked across the room toward them and asked, "You knew too?" The relative's eyes filled with panic. But instead of denying it, they said something that opened an entirely new question: "Yes. And I tried to stop it once, but what happened afterward is the reason I stayed silent." The relative who claimed they had tried to stop everything finally explained what happened. Early in the interference, they confronted the person spreading doubts about you and demanded that your soulmate be allowed to speak with you directly. For a moment, they believed the warning had worked. The rumors stopped. Nobody mentioned you for several days. Then your soulmate received a new piece of information, something so personal and believable that it convinced them the family must have learned it directly from you. That was when this relative realized the interference had not stopped, it had simply become more sophisticated. They challenged the person responsible again, but this time they were told, "Stay out of it, or you'll make everything worse." They backed down, a decision they now admitted they regretted. Because shortly afterward, your soulmate stopped defending the relationship and began believing there was nothing left to defend. Your soulmate listened carefully, then asked what that personal information had been. The relative hesitated because they knew the answer would reopen one of the deepest wounds from the separation. Your soulmate had been told that you privately described your connection as something that could never become permanent. Those words had crushed them. They never told the family how much. They simply became quieter and eventually stopped mentioning you altogether. But now the relative admitted they had never heard those words from you. Worse, they later discovered where the claim originated. Someone had taken a completely different conversation, removed its context, and turned it into a statement about your relationship. The family hadn't merely passed along a misunderstanding. Someone had shaped an interpretation they knew would strike directly at your soulmate's greatest fear, that you never saw the same future they did. For several seconds, your soulmate said nothing. Then they asked to see whatever remained from that original conversation. The relative reached for their phone and revealed they had saved a partial copy because, even then, something about the story felt wrong. Don't skip, because your soulmate immediately noticed a detail everyone else had overlooked. The original words did not mention ending the relationship at all. In fact, when read in context, they appeared to concern uncertainty about circumstances surrounding the two of you, not uncertainty about your feelings. Your soulmate looked up and asked, "Who changed the meaning?" Nobody answered at first. Then the person who had broken their silence finally pointed toward the relative who started the interference. But before another accusation could be made, that relative whispered, "I changed it, but I wasn't the one who gave them the original conversation." The room fell silent again, because that meant someone outside the confession had been quietly supplying information about you from the very beginning. The moment they admitted someone else had supplied the original conversation, your soulmate stopped looking angry and became intensely focused. "Who?" they asked. The relative hesitated, then explained that the information had come through someone who knew pieces of your situation but had never actually heard you reject your soulmate. They had shared an observation, nothing more. But once that observation entered the family, it was rewritten into certainty. A concern became a warning. Uncertainty became rejection. And eventually, your soulmate was told that you had already decided there was no future together. The outside person had no idea their words were being used that way. When they later heard what supposedly happened between you, they even questioned whether the family had misunderstood them. That question was ignored. Your soulmate finally saw the pattern clearly. Whenever reality threatened the story, someone simply adjusted the story. Then your soulmate asked whether anyone had ever gone back to that outside person and confirmed what they actually meant. The answer was yes, but that conversation had also been hidden. Months earlier, the person who first broke their silence contacted them privately because guilt had become unbearable. They asked one direct question: did they ever tell you they wanted this relationship to end? The response came immediately: no. They had never heard you say that. They had never be.